ready?
Yep.
Good afternoon, my name is Kit Loschiuk, and I'm at the Biddeford Museum, and this afternoon I'm going to be reading A Wedding at Four Winds Farm by LM Montgomery. This was published on the 2nd of November in 1900. So we'll start with The Wedding at Four Winds Farm. When Margaret Clark accepted her cousin's invitation to spend a winter's fortnight at Four Winds Farm, she did not know that Ross Miller was to be there too. He likewise was in a state of blissful ignorance. Both of them, had they known of each other's prospective presence, would have betaken themselves as far as possible from Four Winds Farm. Mrs. Aldrich, out of the goodness and kindness of her heart, was responsible for this bungle. She had known in the preceding summer that Ross and Margaret were engaged, and as she did not know of their later quarrel and parting, she supposed that to spend 2 whole weeks buried in snowdrifts and country hills at Four Winds Farm would fulfill their conception of Eden as nearly as anything possible. Moreover, in order sweetly to surprise them, she never said a word to either about the other, so that when Margaret, tall and fair and stately, rose from her chair by the fire to meet Ross Miller in his snowy storm coat, both were as beautifully stiff and taken aback as can be imagined, while poor Mrs. Aldrich was puzzled, and began to have a dismal presentiment that she made a mess of things somehow. However, Miss Clark and her ex-fiancé knew what was due to their hostess, so they both were charmingly polite and cool to each other, and supper was a smooth affair, although a rather chilly one. Ross Miller secretly made up in his mind to get a telegram next day summoning him back to town on urgent business. But the storm that had begun that night was raging with such fury next morning that it was quite impossible for him to get anywhere for an excuse. "We're in for a good old-fashioned snowstorm," announced Mr. Aldrich cheerfully. "You'll see, you city folks who don't know what a real snowstorm is. It will snow all day and drift all tomorrow, and the roads will have to be broken all the next. Four Winds deserves its name, and no mistake. If there is a breath of wind or a sprinkle of snow, we're going to get it." Ross Miller, who hadn't slept a wink all night, looked as if in doubt whether to be thankful or not, and Margaret ate her egg with an exaggerated air of indifference as to whether it stormed for a week. Mrs. Aldrich by this time was sure that there was something seriously wrong. She saw that the ring Margaret had worn in the summer was gone, and although she was a woman of tact and resource, she felt honestly appalled at the thought of having 2 ex-lovers, who might possibly hate each other now, shut up in her house for 2 or 3 stormy days. This was her first view of it. But as she turned the matter over in her mind, her spirits rose. Suppose it had only been a lover's quarrel or misunderstanding, and these 2 really cared for each other yet, and were only in need of a friendly third to bring them together again. If that were so, Mrs. Aldrich felt she was sure foreordained of Providence to be that third. But she must make no more mistakes. "I must find out from Margaret just how matters stand," she reflected. "She'll tell me if I ask her. Then I'll see what can be done." That afternoon, when Mrs. Aldrich had settled herself cozily down in her favorite corner with her fancy work, she began her reconnaissance. Margaret was leaning back in the big sleepy hollow chair with her arms clasped above her head. She had a book in her lap, but she was not reading, and her eyes were fixed dreamily on the fire. Mrs. Aldrich gave a little cough and then said, "Margaret, why don't you tell me what happened before that your engagement with Ross was broken? I wouldn't have made the mistake of inviting you here together then." Margaret came out of her reverie with a slight little start and flush. "I supposed you knew," she said rather nervously. All our friends in town did. Didn't any of them tell you? No, town gossip never gets out this far as Four Winds. We are really buried alive here. I suppose you are blessing me in capitals for getting you into this scrape. Not at all, said Margaret, trying to speak indifferently. Don't let that worry you, Amy. It really doesn't bother me in the least. Perhaps Mr. Miller may feel uncomfortable, although I don't think he cares either. There was some bitterness in Margaret's concluding clause, and Mrs. Aldrich got so excited that she matched the two wrong shades on her cushion. Now, how did it happen, Margaret? Tell me all about it, dear. When you were here last summer, you seemed to think the world of each other. Margaret rumpled the leaves of her book and bit her lip. There isn't much to tell, she said at last. It all seems really silly now. We had a quarrel last fall. Ross acted abominably, and I broke the engagement. We were not suited to each other, and it was better to find out at that time. I have been much happier since. That's a fib, thought Mrs. Aldrich, but aloud she merely said, Yes, and how about Ross? Oh, he doesn't care, answered Margaret quickly. He never did. He took his dismissal very coolly. It was all a mistake, Amy. We never really cared for each other, you know. Another fib, thought Mrs. Aldrich. But perhaps Ross does care after all, she suggested. No, and it wouldn't make no difference if he did, answered Margaret coldly. It was all his fault, and I will never forgive him. He knows that perfectly well. Let's talk about something else, Amy. What is that you're making? It's awfully pretty. It's a cushion, said Mrs. Aldrich, displaying her work proudly. Yes, it is pretty. I think I'm making it as a wedding present for two friends of mine who are to be married very soon. Really? Who? Do I know them? You know the groom very well, but the bride, no, I don't think you're acquainted with her, although I dare say you've seen her. The wedding is to be here at Four Winds Farm. Why, Amy Aldrich! Yes, and highly contracting parties are very old friends of ours. We are going to give them as nice a wedding as possible. We had planned to have you as bridesmaid and Ross as best man, but now I suppose some other arrangement must be made. Tom will give away the bride, and I shall bake the wedding cake. Amy, you mysterious creature, what do you mean? Who are they? Well, the groom is Martin Hepburn, and the bride is Sarah Williams, from the corner town road. The same, and Sarah is our washerwoman. They've been engaged for years and years, off and on. Oh, it's quite a romantic story, I assure you, although the fact that Martin is 60 and gray, and that Sarah is 45 and has red knuckles and redder hair may detract from the romance in your eyes. Just tell me about it, please, entreated Margaret. To think that Margaret is going to be married again. I thought he had a strangely jubilant air last night, and I actually heard him whistling Annie Laurie around the barns. Poor Sarah, her brow is hardly like the snowdrift. Martin thinks it is. In his eyes she is the most beautiful woman that ever walked this earth, and in hers he is the perfect man. Well, tell me about them, said Margaret, tossing away her book and settling herself comfortably. Martin and Sarah have loved each other since they were boy and girl together. Tom's mother told me the beginning of the story. Martin has always lived here at Four Winds Farm. He loves the spot as if it were his own. I believe, and we all are much attracted to him. Good old Martin. I don't suppose Sarah could ever have been pretty at her best, and as certainly Martin was never handsome. Sarah lived with her bedridden mother in a little house on the corner town road, and supported herself by day work. She and Martin became engaged. I saw the engagement ring. Martin showed it to me one day, long ago, before he went to put it back on Sarah's distorted finger. It wasn't a diamond, I'm not sure that it was even gold, very likely not, but it was a thin, brassy-looking little ring with two hands clasping what is called friendship ring, I believe. I don't think you would admire it, but Sarah does. Oh dear, yes. She is as proud of that ring as if it were the coney ore that were set in it. Martin and Sarah could not marry so long as her mother lived. Old Mrs. William was, to put it mildly, a crank, and Sarah was nothing better than a slave. She was a good doctor, tender, unselfish, and patient. Nobody ever heard her say a harsh word to her mother, and when Mrs. Williams at last died, Sarah mourned for her as sincerely and deeply as if she had been the best mother in the world. Mrs. Williams died in the spring, and Martin and Sarah were to be married in the fall. Sarah had her wedding dress made, the same one she is going to wear next Wednesday. It will be terrible old-fashioned, no doubt, but Martin will never suspect it, and Sarah won't care. I don't think it was a pretty dress, even when new. The stuff is a dingy brown merino, and Sarah made it herself. She hasn't a gift for dressmaking, I'll submit. A month before the appointed day, Sarah's cousin over in Cornerstown died. She had been a widow and left 4 children, one of whom was a cripple. There was nobody to look after them but Sarah. She adopted the whole 4 and calmly announced her intention to provide for them. That settled the question of her marriage. Martin was very angry and declared he'd have no more waiting. She must choose between him and those children. Sarah said she must look after the children. She thought it was her duty, see? So Martin left her. How horrid of him, exclaimed Margaret. Yes, it wasn't very honorable. Martin has a bad temper. But Sarah thought he was quite right and would never allow a word to be said against him in her presence. You see, she loved him. Margaret flushed uneasily, but Mrs. Aldrich did not look up from her work. That closed the first part of Sarah's love story. For the next 20 years, her life was a hard one of drudgery. She brought those children up and did it well. She got luxuries for the sick one, though goodness knows how she managed it. As for Martin, he sulked for a year or 2, and then married Lida Banks. I believe he did it as much to spite Sarah as for any other reason, but he was very good to her. They lived in that little 4-roomed house down the other end of the farm. Lida was a sickly woman, and Martin was always very tender and patient with her. She died 10 years ago. Meanwhile, Sarah's children had grown up. 2 of them were married, and the boy was out west doing well. The little cripple still lived with her. Sarah had not grown any prettier in her hard life. Her figure was stooped, her face was worn, and there were crow's feet around her eyes. She still had to work very hard for the sick girl. Martin began to see her again, and she took him back without a word of reproach. I'd have, began Margaret hotly, then checked herself. Mrs. Aldrich went on calmly. Yes, it was very spiritless of her, of course. Still, she did. She forgave him everything, and Martin put his old ring back on her finger. That was just 6 years ago. Sarah could not see her way clear to Martin as long as the little invalid girl was alive. The doctor said she could not last long. Martin must wait. Martin was much older and a good deal more patient now. He was willing to wait. He has waited these 6 years. They are the 2 happiest people in the world. Margaret. Martin worships the very ground Sarah treads on, and her devotion is something beautiful to see. When Martin told us he was going to be married, Tom and I offered to give them a wedding. How pleased they were. We are going to have all their friends here, and we are helping Martin to fix up his little house for his bride as nicely as we can. Sarah is very poor, you know, and her setting out will be of rather scanty description. I'm sure I don't know who we'll have for bridesmaid, and best man now. Martin was so pleased at the idea of having you. Just as an aside, I think that when they say Sarah was very poor, and you know her setting out will be a rather scanty description, I would imagine that would have been her trousseau, I would say.
And her linens.
Her trousseau.
Yeah.
Oh, can't I be bridesmaid still? Cried Margaret quickly. I'd like to be Amy, I really would. But the best man? Oh, I dare say Mr. Miller won't mind if I don't, said Margaret Redding. We needn't have much to do with each other. It would be a pity to disappoint Martin and Sarah. I'll do all I can to give them a nice wedding. I think it's splendid. That evening, Ross, who had been talking to Mrs. Aldrich, summoned up enough courage to ask Margaret if she were going to be bridesmaid. Will it make any difference to you, Miss Clark, if they put me down for best man? He said, awkwardly. Not at all, answered Margaret coldly. The bride and groom wish it, and so does Amy. We might as well help them all we can. Margaret threw herself heart and soul into the wedding preparations, and Ross seconded her efforts. They could not avoid sundry consultations and almost friendly discussions over various points. They helped to fix up Martin's little house for the homecoming of the bride. They put their heads together and decided that Ross should give Sarah a dinner set and Margaret a general supply of table linen. They wandered through the woods for a whole afternoon and gathered fir boughs to decorate Four Winds Farm. And they stoned the raisins for the wedding cake. Ross sent to the most fashionable florist in town and got white roses for Sarah, such as any bride might have gloried in. And Margaret basted cuffs and collars of real lace in the neck of sleeves of the old faded wedding dress. The wedding itself was a brilliant success, although it was never chronicled in the society papers. The bride and groom were old and poor and plain, but they were glorified by a halo of true love. Even the beautiful bridesmaid envied happy Sarah. The wedding supper and merry evening followed the ceremony, and when at last Sarah put on her shabby hat and jacket and took Martin's arm proudly to walk over the fields to their own little house, Ross hurled a pound of rice over them, and Margaret threw an old shoe at the groom, so such a good aim that it struck a harmless Cornerstown guest squarely on the head. When the guests had gone and Margaret went slowly back to the deserted parlor and stood looking sadly at the fire, the wedding at Four Winds Farm was over, and she must go back to town. How pleasant it had all been, and how happy Sarah had been. Russ Miller, coming in silently, saw Margaret put her hands over her face and heard a distinct sob. In one stride he was beside her, and she was in his arms. Margaret, darling, forgive me and take me back, won't you? It was all my jealous temper. No, no, sobbed Margaret. It was my hateful pride. I've let it master me for so long, while Sarah... But you love me yet, don't you? And I love you more than ever, sweetheart. We've seemed to come so near to each other lately, I couldn't bear the thought of drifting apart again. We won't. Oh, we won't, Ross. I've learned a lesson from Sarah. Dear, good, unselfish Sarah. She doesn't dream how much good she's done me. If it hadn't been for her story and her, I'd have gone on being horrible and bitter and breaking my own heart. Dear Sarah. And that is the end. You almost had me in tears at the end.